Yeah, I see we're still just trickling on in here. We'll be starting momentarily. Well. Thank you so much for joining us. First off, I'd like to let you know that we are going to be recording this talk, so you should turn off your video if you don't want to be in the recording. Also, if you can all mute yourself if you haven't already, please do that now. Well, I'm Ry Rockland from Artists for Democracy. Welcome to the fifth talk in our Artists for Democracy Artist Talk series. We are so excited to have Christina Quarles and Frederick Janka here talking with us today. Really, it is truly an honor and a pleasure to have them both. Very excited for this evening.
Christina Quarles.
Thank you. I just was corrected. Christina Quarles. I've been working on that, but
No worries.
yeah. Once again, A4D member Marissa. Oh, but
Nick.
Foodernick, thank you. We'll be talking about the different environmental policy positions on the ballot. Then Frederick Janka from Carolyn Glasso Bailey Foundation will introduce you to Christina Quarles, who will give a presentation about her work, followed by a conversation with Freddie. If you have questions for either of them, please enter them in the chat, and they will answer them at the end of the talk. Then Deborah Asheim will talk about an exciting collaboration we are part of, and Kaisa Johnson will give you a few super quick tips on common mail-in voting mistakes that could invalidate your ballot. So with that, I will say, take it away, Marissa.
Hi, I'm Marissa Frederick from Artists for Democracy, and we've been asking you to tell us what issues you care about this year. And you've told us that the environment and climate change is one of the most important issues to you. It's not surprising because this is a defining issue of our time. Scientific American magazine has actually endorsed a political candidate for the first time in its 175-year history. The magazine cited that due to COVID-19 and climate change, the 2020 election is literally a matter of life and death. This isn't a matter for the future, it's happening now. It's a health issue, it's an economic issue, it's a social justice issue disproportionately affecting disadvantaged communities. Natural disasters are happening more often and are more severe and are affecting all regions of the country, from floods to hurricanes, droughts, fires, rising sea levels that are already affecting places like Florida on a regular basis, and raking the leaves in the forest just won't cut it. There are also tons of good jobs that can be created through clean and green energy programs. And really, this issue is about science and about facts. And all of this is on the ballot, and it's part of why voting in the election matters so much. So, Joe Biden is endorsed by Greta Thunberg. Biden believes that climate change is real, and he has a plan to address it. Biden will put the US on track to achieve a 100% clean energy economy and reach net zero emissions before 2050. Biden will rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. Biden will establish an environmental and climate justice division in the Department of Justice and establish an Office of Climate Change and Health Equity in the Department of Health and Human Services, because he understands it's a health issue too. Biden proposes a $2 trillion clean energy overhaul plan, which he'll finance by rolling back Trump tax incentives that enrich corporations. Biden will prioritize strategies and technologies that reduce traditional air pollution in disadvantaged communities, overhaul the EPA External Civil Rights Compliance Office, and create a national crisis strategy to address climate disasters and a strategy that prioritizes equitable disaster risk reduction and response. He'll establish a civilian climate corps modeled on programs from the era of the Great Depression that will put people to work in jobs that make our country cleaner and greener. And Biden will take action against corporate polluters. Donald Trump denies that climate change is real, has no plan for green energy, has already loosened pollution standards for corporations and the fossil fuel industry, has already taken the US out of the historic Paris Climate Agreement, has already rescinded almost 100 regulatory rules that ensured that Americans had access to things like clean air and clean water, has cut the Environmental Protection Agency budget by nearly 1/3, has loosened offshore drilling regulations that were put in place after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which devastated the lives and livelihoods of people living in Gulf coastal states. Those are things that have already been done. This is just scratching the surface of this absolutely critical issue. Please do go to our website where we have more information about this issue and about the other issues that you've told us are important to you in this most important election year. Things like racial justice, criminal justice and policing, healthcare, and the economy. And on our website, you'll also find links to organizations that are working on these critical issues, and you can find out how to get more involved. All of this is what you're going to vote for this year. And so remember this, remember to tell your friends and your family that this is some of what you have to have in mind when you're deciding to go out and vote. Now I'll hand it over to Freddie, who will introduce Christina, and Christina is going to share her practice with us, which we're really excited about.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Frederick Janka. It's a treat to be here. Thanks to everyone at Artists for Democracy for inviting me to chat it up with Christina. I actually didn't have a formal introduction, so I'm just going to throw it off to Christina and trust that, she has an incredible presentation for us to give us some insight into her artistic practice. So why don't you hit it, Christina?
Sure, yeah. All right, I'm gonna start off by trying to share my screen. So this will be the hardest part. So just give me a moment. Okay, and can everyone see the screen?
Maybe looks great, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Freddie can see it, we can all see it. Yeah, so thanks so much for inviting me to speak. Thank you to Artists for Democracy for just putting on all these programs and also for all the work that you guys do. And for everybody who showed up today, I know that there's like a lot of students that are here today and a lot of people that are, younger than me. And I'm really, a lot of my engagement and political activism really comes from being inspired by other people. And so I'm just super inspired by like the younger generation. So I just wanted to thank everybody for all the work you're already doing. So with that, yeah, I wanted to, oh, what's that? Okay, cool. Yeah, so I want to maybe turn down my mic and see if that works. But yeah, I wanted to kind of go over my practice a little bit in case you aren't familiar with it, and just kind of go over what I'm thinking about when I make these paintings, which, I think a lot of times painting, and especially like figurative painting and painting that has like, a ton of bright colors like I love to use, can be seen as maybe apolitical, but there's definitely like an ethics that drives my practice. And so I thought I'd share some of that with you right at the start. And so, yeah, this is a pretty typical painting of mine. I think like if you were to really dumb down my practice, you would say like there's usually figures and they tend to start to bend into abstraction. And there tends to be these perspectival planes that intersect the figures. And in those planes, there's usually either a pattern or these sort of crazy colors. So yeah, that's sort of like the, now for some reason I can't go to the next one, there we go. That's sort of like the dumbed down version of what you'd see in one of my paintings, but really like the intent that I'm trying to get at with this work is I really make these paintings to describe what it is to live within your own body. And so a lot of the time I will describe these works as being portraits, but not portraits of looking at a body, but instead portraits of being in your own body and looking out into the world. And so I'm really pulling from all of my different intersections of my identities and how I move through the world in my own body. And so I think a lot of the time about like what it is to move through the world, like in a gendered body. So for me, I'm cisgender, I'm a woman, but then also what it is to move through the world in a queer body, and what it is to move through the world like in a racialized body. So for me, my race is kind of more complicated, I guess, because my dad is Black and my mom is white. So I really exist in this sort of racially multiple existence, and one that I feel like is oftentimes like not as easily summed up just by the way that I look. And so I think that's something that's really driven me to a practice of describing what it is to move through the world, but one that cannot always be decided by like just looking at people walking down the street. So, I mean, I think that like, I don't know, I think that like my experience with my race is something that's really kind of opened up like the expanse of all the different conflicting, contradictory ways that we experience the world, and ways in which oftentimes legibility or representation can sometimes not be the totality of our experience. And so like, for example, like, I think that like sometimes I'm like, okay, well, maybe I would describe my experience as being somebody who's Black, because of living in this country. Like, I think that like historically we've really kind of adopted this idea that whiteness is really not a racialized position, or at least like whiteness has been able to maintain this position of privilege and of power by really being able to assert that it's this sort of blank slate upon which other identities can be placed onto. And so in that sense, just by the fact that I'm born to one Black parent, like I have a very hard time sort of identifying as being somebody who's white, because I understand myself as existing on this spectrum of identity. And I feel like whiteness really sees itself as being exempt from like a spectrum of identity. But then at the same time, it's like, I know that I move through the world in a body that is often perceived as white, especially by white people. And so I think that like that way that I am seen by other people is something that really has to be taken into account when I try to give an account for what my racial identity is. And so I think that like, you know, a big part of how Black identity is formed, especially in the United States, is through the way white people see Black bodies as being Black. And so just by virtue of the fact that white people usually see me as being white, I have a difficult time then being Black in this country. And so my race is really always this sense of having like my sense of place really being the sense of displace. And so when trying to describe that position in my paintings, I find that really like using skin color alone would really not tell that full story. And so for me with the work, I really try to explore that idea really more through like the compositions of the pieces. And so instead of having like, I don't know, like in this piece, there's like part of the body is kind of this like weird terrazzo stone, and like other parts are these like strange grays, and like these kind of like brushy parts of just raw canvas. And so none of it are skin colors that we'd see in the real world. And that's because I find that actually my experience, like just to use race as one example, is really one that is this sort of always working up against the limits or the boundaries of myself or of the definition, and then having moments of agency or activation within that boundary. So for me, those explorations of being within my own body are really described much more through the composition of these pieces rather than through the, I guess like, yeah, anything that would have to do with like skin pigmentation or like gendered body parts. And so it's the way the bodies have to sort of contort and be held within this space. And then with like the planes, those are like, that's like another opportunity to sort of multiply situate the figures. And so you have like the figure here that's kind of in this like yellow ochre, like tree background. And so I was thinking here about like this location that could either be like trees silhouetted in nature, but you could also have it be like a tapestry or like a printed material on a bolt of fabric. And so these are just ways of having the figures in a context that itself has multiple locations and different references in our own mind. And so, and then also with those planes, they like literally hold the figure in these sort of impossible spaces. And so this figures is like, it's allowed to sort of be suspended in this impossible position, while at the same time, those planes serve to literally fragment and bisect the bodies that they interact with. And so it's this, again, the sense of place also being a moment of displace that's achieved, I think, really through the composition and through the positions of the body in these paintings. So yeah, I think the other important thing to know about my work, especially if you're first being introduced to it in like a digital form, is that anytime you see like this beige sort of area, that's like actually just raw canvas. And so I think also with painting, like a lot of times, I mean, I think with all art, you kind of need to be aware of the fact that it is an object. It's not just an image. So it's, even though like right now we're mostly interacting with art digitally, it's like art does exist in a physical world and is like a dimensional object. And so for me, I've really made sure to not take painting for granted. So by saying that, I mean that like, I don't think of painting as sort of being this neutral thing, even though it's something that we're really familiar with looking at. And so I think a lot of times we forget that painting can have, I guess like material consequences. And so one way of doing that is I use this like really plasticky acrylic paint, and then I use it against this raw exposed canvas. And I think that like one of the reasons why I like started just having a bunch of raw canvas was because I used to just be a drawer or a drawing person. And yeah, so like this is kind of like one of the drawings that would be pretty close to what I applied to grad school with. So this drawing's from 2018, so it's like a few years after I graduated from grad school, but it's very similar to the work that I was doing going into grad school before I started making paintings. And I was like, yeah, I was like just super fascinated throughout the process of grad school, like when I was trying to transition from making drawings into paintings, just how different materials are seen and how things become legible and how certain things we're really trained to just not see. So as somebody that was familiar with drawing and a drawing practice, like I was super familiar with a practice where you would leave large areas of exposed paper, but then, yeah, it just, you would leave areas of exposed paper, but that would never be something that you would talk about like in a critique. You would only talk about the drawing, not like the paper the drawing was on, unless like you had some terrible paper that was like really clear. But for the most part, you just talk about the drawing. And so when I moved into painting, what I found was that like, so this is actually a really recent painting, but all of that is raw canvas. And so when you're in front of that work, like the raw canvas is really super apparent. And so for me, that was just this like really interesting moment where I was able to see like, I don't know, that you can use painting, you can use the history of painting and like the baggage of painting and just all the ways that we're conditioned to see certain things. And we can, I could use that and use that material as a way of exploring sort of like all the ways that we're conditioned to see certain bodies or see certain identities, and how there's certain things, I mean, like whiteness or like being cisgender that you don't think about because it so easily aligns with the norm. But as soon as something starts to deviate from the norm, like being racially multiple or being gender nonconforming, suddenly it's something that is immediately apparent. And suddenly we start talking about gender, we start talking about race. So just to say that the materials that we use as artists, I think really have like a lot of content and like a lot of resonance that can be used. So then just quickly, because I know I really want to like chat with Freddie and like talk about politics and voting and all of that, but I thought I'd just like quickly kind of go through my process. So this is a recent painting, the finished piece. But when I start a painting, so I do like all this like figure drawing ahead of time and all these things to practice my hand, and I take pictures when I'm driving through like LA, and I don't know, I'm just like always observing and soaking up information. But when I get to a canvas, it's really just like me and a raw canvas and nothing else. Like I put everything away and it's just like, yeah, I have like no preconceived idea of what's going to happen. So it's just kind of like anyone's guess. So this is like an early stage of that painting. And so at this point, I've like already laid down like a lot of sort of gestural brushstrokes, and I've started to kind of make connections with where the bodies are going to come out. So it's sort of like this process of like I always say, it's kind of like looking at the clouds and like coming up with images that you see in the clouds. So it's kind of pulling out the figuration from the abstraction. And then at this point, I photograph the work and I bring it into the computer. So I was like a graphic designer for many years, so I know Illustrator pretty well, but I use that now as a tool to really bring in a sketching process like halfway through. So like, oh, my mouse is like invisible, but yeah, these are like 4 different versions of like what this painting could have been when I'm playing around in Illustrator. And in the end, I went with something that was like closer to the bottom right design, which is here. But yeah, I mean, just like this, just to kind of like say that my process is really one where I set out with all these sort of vague intentions that then when I actually apply the material to the canvas are these like set intentions, but then it always ends up being this actuality of what ends up happening, or like drips that end up coming down. And I don't know, it ends up being really more of a conversation with observing what's in front of me rather than relying entirely on like the set path of like what the painting is going to be. So it's something that really emerges through a process of making. And then just real quick here, I just wanted to share just some of like where my inspiration comes from. Because I mean, I'm definitely like, I don't know, I went to Yale for grad school and like, I grew up in LA. So it's not like I'm like some outsider artist, but at the same time, I also get like a ton of inspiration from things that are outside of the art world. So this is like the Bob Baker Marionette Theater on the left and the painting on the right that was sort of like inspired by this strange flattening of a wall painting in LA. Or this is like a taqueria that's in Cypress Park that like, I don't know, I love the way that they like painted the brick and then like painted over some of the brick where probably there was like graffiti or something. And then the way that then that brick like curves. And then that's a painting on the right of like this curved brick that really came from driving past the shop like every day. And then I don't know, this is like a very classic LA sort of like stone structure. And then this is a painting that I did a few years ago, or geez, only last year. And then this is my studio recently. I was finishing up my show that's currently on view in London, and it was like the Bobcat fire had just started. So it was like the skies had turned orange and it was like letting in this orange light into my studio, which was like such a crazy coincidence because I had just like the day before decided with the gallery that I wanted to do these like orange vinyl scrims on the front window. So this is what the show looks like right now in London. So it's like this like firelight coming through, which initially I really wanted this color transition. So, I mean, the same way that I try to not take the material of painting for granted, I also really try to not take the gallery space for granted either. So I really wanted people to be aware that they were like entering into a constructed space by having this color transition when you first walk in. So yeah, that's sort of the like speed dating version of my practice.
That was really wonderful, Christina. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I was when I had a question that I was thinking about, but you answered it right towards the end. I just enjoyed seeing your newest paintings. I thought that was, especially for our conversation, just locating ourselves in the present. We are in sort of unprecedented times, and the agency of artists is even more important. So thank you so much for doing that. I just want to remind everyone, I've been following the chat, so feel free to drop. There have been some great comments. Lots of love, Christina. Lots of love in the chat. And I will just, say, yeah, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. I think, the big question here today, since we're with Artists for Democracy, I think Artists for Democracy is an excellent example of artists bringing their agency together for a greater impact. Just in our preview, set up for today's Zoom, it was wonderful to see everyone's faces, and it just reminds one that we're really living in a time of increased artist agency. And so my question to you, Christina, is, how do you see the responsibility of the artist today, sort of at any stage in their career? I mean, still in school, maybe for some of our audience now, but also for someone like you, as well as maybe some mentors that you've had. But like, what is the artist's responsibility to be civically engaged?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I think I'm still figuring out and coming into, and it's, I think, like a lifelong kind of question and pursuit as an artist, but also just as a person, So like, I think the main thing that I've consistently returned to is that art in and of itself is political action. It's something that I think continues to be very important and a worthwhile pursuit. But it's also, it's not the full picture. And so I think that in our lives and being just well-rounded people, we need to engage with a number of different areas. And so for me, that's always been a real commitment to my artistic practice and a real care in the images that I put out into the world and the way I speak about it, and taking that very seriously. But then at the same time, knowing that that's only going to be able to hit so many marks, and then to also like incorporate engagement in a lot of different fields. So whether that's donating money or donating art to an organization, raising awareness about an organization, volunteering, I don't know, being ethical in the way that I shop, or the way that I tip, or the way that I just like treat people on the street. And I think just kind of having it be like the sort of multi-tiered thing. I think like as artists, we're really used to sort of getting inspiration from all different sources. I mean, like even like just the few slides I showed at the end, but like, I think in the same way, it's also about sort of giving in just as diverse of a way to your community and to the world that you're in.
Well, and I wonder if you have any sort of like criteria that you use, when someone approaches you, or like what are the sort of hallmarks of deserving efforts and organizations that you find or that appeal to you, just as an example for others?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain things that have sort of always remained important to me. Just sort of like, blanket organizations like the ACLU, and, and of course, reinvesting into like nonprofit museums and things like that. But more recently, I mean, when the pandemic started, I became really invested in just kind of, on the side, not like in a very public way, but, donating to LA Food Bank and to like my local farmers market, making sure that their EBT program stays up and running. Just because I think that, I think access to just really immediate needs, like having nutritious food, is something that can make all the difference, like in your daily experience. I mean, like we can like talk theory all we want, but like if you live in like a food desert, don't have access to a meal, like that's what you're going to be thinking about. And I know that like when schools shut down, like public schools, I mean, in Los Angeles, I mean, that was a huge source for people having access to free meals. So that was something like at the beginning of the pandemic that seemed really important, that I started to kind of up my contributions to. And then I was really inspired by seeing like Lauren Halsey's organization, and like the way that she was making all these food boxes for her community, which I felt like was really tapping into that, like on a scale that was just so awe-inspiring for me. And like, I don't know, I mean, I know she's going to be talking like soon with Artists for Democracy, so like I'm sure she can explain it way better than me. But just as somebody who's like an artist and a peer that saw that, like, I don't know, it meant so much to me to see somebody that I know donates to all the same like charity auctions that I donate to, because we're always like in them together. Like we both just did prints for Project Angel Food, which also delivers meals, but primarily to people with dealing with AIDS or with other terminal illnesses. But like to see her doing something that didn't even involve like her art. I mean, I guess you could argue that it involves her larger art practice of being engaged with her community, but it just like, it wasn't about exchanging her art. It was really about touching in with her community and sort of doing something that had nothing to do with art trading hands. And so that like was what really kind of got me inspired to do over the summer, just this like a match donation campaign as a way to just kind of engage people with something that didn't have any like reward at the end other than giving and other than like being able to be in touch with organizations that maybe people didn't know about as much. So I wanted to focus on, I mean, I guess also kind of inspired by an arts organization. There was this, I'm like spacing on the name right now, but it was like over the summer they did like around the 4th of July, it was like 70 artists like wrote messages in the sky having to do with like,
In Plain Sight. It's called In Plain
Sight. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, that's something I've been for, I mean, for a long time, but I think more recently it's been more urgent, like over the last 4 years of this administration, thinking about the way that we treat immigrants and thinking about the way that we separate families at the border. And so I had a lot of the match donations being toward causes that kind of help with immigration bonds and with detention centers, kind of releasing people, especially now in a pandemic when that's like literally life or death. But I think like that just comes from, you know, a history of engaging kind of with my own practice with thinking about like ancestral trauma, like going back to like the transatlantic like slave trade and kind of thinking about like, I guess just thinking about the ramifications over generations that happens and being just sort of unable to stay complicit to a country that's enacting these traumas right now and thinking about just the generations moving forward that are going to be dealing with this. So that was something that, I don't know, I felt moved to raise more awareness toward and money for. And then also just in general, like the like anti-incarceration, like abolitionist movements moving into like largely Black and brown communities. So I don't know, things like Free Black Mamas is like another organization that's been one that I've been donating to for a long time. So I wanted to bring attention to that through that campaign. So yeah.
Well, I think something that you shared that really resonated with me, you know, was about listening to your community or being, you know, really being a part of a community. And I think that in a way that's such a great starting point, I think, for someone who, you know, might just be, you know, young and broke and frustrated. And like, how do you know, what are some tools to feel that you're being a responsible artist and civically engaged? You know, I think being able to, you know, tap into your larger community of fellow artists and, you know, look to what your mentors are doing, but also to, yeah, some of the grassroots projects that really $20 or just showing up and volunteering really makes a difference, you know? I think
like there's like all these different ways you can remain accountable to certain organizations by being involved. I mean, I think even just like the reason why I wanted to do a match donation was because even a donation of like $10, like you get on a mailing list and you are kind of, you can stay in touch with an organization, and then, you know, maybe next year you have $20 that you can give, or like maybe next year you actually have $0 you can give, but then you can like hop on the phone and do some volunteer work there. Or like, I don't know, I just think it's about staying in touch with different organizations and really casting like a wide net. And as you live your life, you can start to like maybe hone in on certain things, or maybe certain issues become more important to you. But at the beginning, it's like, I think it's really just about kind of taking a lot of different approaches and kind of seeing what happens. Because so much of it, like you're saying, so much of it is about, it's about sort of inspiring other people and being inspired by other people and kind of having it snowball and transition and turn into these things that are bigger than what you started off with.
Oh, totally. And I think that's the process of doing the work, right? You know, I was just on a great Zoom yesterday with the Field Museum in Chicago about, you know, Indigenous land acknowledgements. And it was for Indigenous women. And, you know, my takeaway from it was like, you need to do the work. Yes, you can go and talk to somebody and get this like, package deal, but
Yeah.
you're missing the whole point. And so I think, for this idea of like how to be a civically engaged artist too is, there isn't one recipe, right?
Yeah.
You do the work, you figure it out, and you figure out where you can make an impact, where your efforts and resources resonate the most. But I think at the end of the day, I think we can both agree that it's critical that you pay attention and be engaged. Like
Yeah.
you're a part of the future. You're a part of determining what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think that something I've been thinking a lot about lately is sort of how it's kind of similar to an artistic practice in the sense that it's like, I don't know, it's like I didn't just wake up one day and decide to make the paintings that I'm sharing with you guys today. It's like it's been a long journey of like a lot of different experiments and sometimes failed experiments and sketches and different mediums that I've tried out. And it's like you kind of try a lot of different things and you kind of see what resonates, see what sticks, and you just keep building it. I mean, even the paintings I make now are just part of a long trajectory of me investing in my practice. And I think that's sort of how I've been approaching whenever I feel like, oh, I don't know if I'm doing enough or doing the right things. It's like it's easy to feel sort of timid about it. But I think as artists, it's like we're familiar with this kind of larger experimental process, and one where you just kind of have to try some things to see where the shortcomings are, like where your investments are and what matters to you. And I think the important thing is to really act in like many different ways and hit a lot of different levels. And some of those are going to be grand gestures and some of them are going to be quiet gestures. And I mean, I definitely, like the last few months, I've really been putting all my efforts towards the election. So, I mean, I've been donating like, I don't know, just like art left and right to like, to everything to do with like helping with voter suppression, helping with raising awareness about how to vote. I actually, interesting, like there was like only one campaign I donated to that was directly for the Biden campaign. Most things have been about just generally getting people to vote, because that's a huge thing, is getting younger people and people that, have a lot of politics that I think I would agree with actually out to the polls to vote. Because, yeah, I mean, I think just like as an artist, it's easy to sort of be like, like, oh, I have this like really cool political like aesthetic, like I dress cool, I'm like bohemian, I'm like cool in all these ways, but it's like, but then it's about actually like kind of showing up and like you're saying, do the work. And like, sometimes you have to vote and like, that's not exactly like the flashiest, like hippest thing you can do on the outside, but it's actually like super meaningful and important to do. So I think it's about like showing up beyond just like the aesthetic of politics.
Oh, totally. And I know we're probably, getting short on time here. And I thought that, at the beginning of your last comment, you did a nice circle back to your artistic practice. And we did have a couple of questions come up in the chat that related to your artistic practice. And I think I really, appreciated your comment about just experimentation. And I think that definitely comes out in your work. And so one of them specifically was a student entering the printmaking world, Sarah. She was asking about, integrating printing into the painting process, or painting into the printing process, one of the others. Mm-hmm. But I think, just, touching on material, another person asked about inspiration. So maybe it's kind of another closing thought, we can kind of touch on inspiration and material in your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of like, I mean, not to sort of like, I don't know, kind of arbitrarily compound issues, but I mean, I think it's really important just as like a human being, but especially as like an artist to kind of not stay in just your lane all the time, to sometimes go into other lanes and, not from a selfish standpoint, but ultimately you do have a lot of enrichment that comes from that. And so, I mean, a big part of, I'd say two main parts of my process that can start to, I think even when you're in front of the painting, can start to feel more like they start to fall into printmaking or into design. I mean, one of that comes from a long period of my 20s where I was working as a graphic designer just to make ends meet and like make some cash on the side. And that's like when I learned how to do Adobe Illustrator. And then in grad school, I took a screen printing class. So that's when I learned a lot of techniques that now I apply to my paintings through a process of stenciling, where then I will remove the stencil, but it's all very tactile and like painty. And it's not like, I don't know, I would like horrify, I think, most printmakers because I'm so not a precise edition type person. But it was like I took a screen printing class. I don't do screen printing in my work, but a lot of those techniques were inspired from just experimenting with a process. That's one that influenced how I could then apply paint to canvas and think about how I use different tools and do different like scrims of paint. So yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to step outside of your comfort zone, or to, try something where you really are not super experienced, because there's just so much to learn from that and gain from that learning process. And you never know where it's going to lead. I mean, I've definitely taken some classes where I'm like, well, that actually never amounted to anything, but maybe it will in 20 years, who knows?
Yeah. Well, no, I think that's, again, a nice way to bring it back to the topic at hand. I think, yeah, definitely this experimentation and going outside your lane sometimes, and, things that, we're not comfortable. I know that sometimes it can be uncomfortable, saying things or doing things that may, be different from what you've done before. And, but I think, in the end, we all seem to grow and become much better people, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part about the election coming up too, is just I don't know, I think it's easy to feel kind of embarrassed maybe about what you don't know, or what like your shortcomings are with being engaged with the political process. I know that, I mean, even right before this call, when we were doing like a sound check, I asked a question about mail-in ballots, and it's like, here I am talking about voting, and I still have questions. And so one of the things I've been trying to do right now is just be really transparent with people about what I don't know, like being okay with asking questions. And then also trying to really put out information for other people. So I think that that's like a really great way that, I mean, I'm sure everybody here is on some level involved and hopefully going to be voting, just because you're spending your Tuesday night here with us on Zoom. But like, I think it's really about like making sure your friends like be like, hey, you're planning to vote, right? And like, do you know how to vote? Or like, do you need like a voter guide? Like, this is one that I found interesting. I mean, it's not about telling people what to do, but it's like giving people the resources that maybe they're like too shy to ask for. Because it can be
Totally. And that's the thing. I mean, I think your civic engagement starts with your own community, right?
yeah.
Your own circle of friends, and making sure that, that there's also some accountability for yourself and for your community.
Yeah.
But it's really that, yeah, we're not in a way voting just on our own, but we're voting, as a country, like everyone. This is something super important to help, define our future. So,
Yeah. Well, and even like with the election itself, it hits so many different notes. I mean, there's of course the presidential election, which I think is incredibly important. But I mean, I was, again, to be like not hypocritical, I voted before doing this talk, and I'd been researching over the weekend all the different measures on the ballot and stuff. And there's so many things that are hopefully going to really impact my immediate community. And, I live in California, so it's like, I could be jaded and be like, we're probably just going to vote for Biden anyway. But it's like, there's like really important measures, and all the way down to even just like my local community library wanting like some extra resources to like keep the bathrooms clean. So it's like, I don't know, it's like you can kind of hit these bigger things, and then also like the smaller things within like your immediate community. And then, yeah, just continuing to engage with people around you. And I don't know, I mean, bringing that ethics into like how you engage with people around you, and like, I don't know, to not shut people down, I think is like a big thing as an artist. Like, you get so much more from bringing people into a conversation than shutting people out from it. And so I think a big part of that is like, knowing that it is like, I mean, I grew up with the privilege of having a mom who could vote and did vote. And so I grew up being familiar with voting. Like, it was something that I grew up with, but, I can't presume that everybody grew up with that. And so it's, I think, important to kind of be open that people are going to come from different backgrounds, and to not like judge that, but to bring people into the conversation.
Well, exactly. And again, I think that's, Artists for Democracy, you guys have been doing a great job in bringing a lot of different voices to the table. And so, props to you. It's been a pleasure to be a part of this. Thank you, Christina. I know that our team has some other announcements to make, but Christina, it's really been a treat. Enjoy. I wish I could go to Pilar Carias now.
I know.
In person.
Yeah, if anyone's in London, it's
Exactly.
like, what are you doing here? You can't vote.
Exactly. But that the use of the gels and really that this haunting light that should be even more of a call to action in our community,
No.
right? In many ways. Are there any other questions from the audience? It seemed like we had a lot of great people agreeing to ask questions. Laws are changing, rules are changing. Oh, don't be afraid to ask questions. Lots of really cool work comments. But I think we'll probably pass it on to our Artists for Democracy team, unless Christina, do you have a closing comment or anything you'd like to add?
Just that, yeah, just to be engaged with your community, I would say. I mean, so much of my action has been a direct response to being inspired by people around me and artists around me, especially that have really, especially in the last 6 months, really come up to the plate and come up with different ways of being engaged. And I found it to be incredibly inspiring. And then from there, I mean, I've had other people, like even for one of the groups that's working a lot with Artists for Democracy with Walk the Walk, I had a former peer from grad school start a fundraiser for that campaign. And she said that she was inspired by the work I was doing. And so it was like, it's just nice to see sometimes how something, because you just feel like right now you're just kind of putting things out into the internet and who knows what's going to land. But I've really seen recently that, what other people are doing has been so inspiring for me to take action. Then what I do leads to other people being inspired, and it just is going to go on and on. So I think that's ways to sometimes ground yourself from not feeling too helpless in the current situation, and just to definitely please vote and vote early, and check in with your friends and family and make sure that they're voting, and be open to see if they have any questions, and hopefully you can help them because you're doing these talks.
So I managed to miss a question early on. This is very specific, so I'm going to read it to you. Will you talk about the way the figures in the paintings are navigating the rigid geometric spaces on the canvases and the figures' relationship to comfort, discomfort, perhaps citing one work as an example?
Sure, I will share my screen so I can cite a work.
They all kind of do a little bit of that.
Right here, I think it'll, let's see, where's one where everyone's super crazy positioned? Okay, this work maybe. So like, I don't know, I think a lot about like intimacy in my work, and I think about the ways that there's these sort of, basically the intimacies are these moments of being kind of fully embodied. And so they're moments that encompass both maybe more pleasurable moments of friendship or love or familial relationships, but they also encompass moments of violence or hunger or sickness, or death and mourning. And so I try to play with these positions in the frame of these moments of these fully embodied experiences that are really kind of touching on that kind of multifaceted way that we engage with intimacy. And then also, I mean, just thinking, because when I think about like returning again to this idea of my sense of self really, and my sense of my various identities being encompassed through the compositions of these pieces, I think a lot about how it's not quite as simple as just being like, well, I'm in a set of constructed identities and therefore I'm like boxed in by them. It's like also within those limits, I have a lot of agency, and there's a lot of room to sort of play with the limits when you're aware of them. And so with the compositions, I'm constantly looking for ways of challenging the way the figure can exist in the frame so that they can be both, kind of, I mean, I think the person that asked the question put it nicely, of being both in a comfortable position and a very uncomfortable position and kind of working with comfort and discomfort at the same time, because rarely in my life have I experienced anything that's ever been like an either or. It's always like a both and situation, including working kind of with the limits of identity. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel a lot of the work, there's this sort of like push and pull and tension and this, yeah, almost like it's a skin. The paint is sort of like a skin on the canvas that's kind of being pulled and pushed. And well, thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you everyone for coming. I know that Artists for Democracy has some important announcements to make up next. So please hang in there. Party's not over yet. And again, thank you to Christina. So much fun.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you.
I'm passing on the baton. We'll have to do it again, Christina, okay?
Yeah, definitely. All right, thanks guys. I'll mute myself now.
Yeah, passing it along.
I guess I'm on. Okay. So I'm just wanting to make an announcement about an exciting collaboration between the artist Ruben Ochoa, who was our first artist in our lecture series. He's working with Aliso Press to make a series of boating inspired prints that are based on his mother's Mexican restaurant in Oceanside, and they encourage people to vote in using the formal language of the sign that says the restaurant is closed in Spanish and Mandarin. And Ruben is donating 60% of the proceeds from the sale of these prints to support 3 groups, which is Artists for Democracy, and then the other 2 are Crenshaw Dairy Mart, which is a grassroots organization, an art gallery and artist space in Inglewood, and then Dignity and Power Now, which is an organization that's a nonprofit that's been around since 2012, working to abolish the stain on society of the criminal justice system and unfair incarceration, and working for justice reform. So we're really honored to be working with Ruben. And you're probably thinking, but I'm a student or I'm a professor, I can't afford an art print. Well, they're at a really accessible price point. They're $150 each. And so this is a great way to help support democracy, help financially keep the work going. I noticed that Jeff put in the chat that this work needs to continue after November 3rd. And we are so down. We want to work with all of you guys. We want to build a coalition with these other really great groups and to keep doing this important work. And so I hope the fact that we brought you all together for these talks and maybe, maybe opportunity to have an amazing print and help support the work that all of us are doing, and then build a coalition of all of these groups working in really important spaces that's work overlaps, and that will be what we do after whatever happens in 3 weeks.
Hey, hi everyone. I'm just going to quickly go through some of the top 5 reasons that a mail-in ballot can be rejected, so you can look out for it if you're going to vote by mail. The first one is missed deadlines. Every state has a different deadline. It could be a postmark date or when it arrives by. There's a link in the chat that will tell you what your state's rules are. The second one is forgetting to sign. So make sure you sign the back of your ballot where you're told to. Read the instructions very carefully. Sorry, car going off. The next is a non-matching signature. So to be sure to sign in the way that you would normally sign something, the way that you signed the last time that you voted. The fourth one is, in some states, there is a witness signature that's required. So make sure that if you're in one of those states, you have a witness sign it or a notary. Again, there's a list of those states in one of the links in the chat. And the last one is other, so it's a lot of different things. But very importantly, in Pennsylvania, which is going to be one of the deciding states in this election, there is an extra envelope that you need to put your ballot in. So if your ballot is not in that envelope, it will not get counted. So if you are in Pennsylvania, I think a lot of people actually are watching from Pennsylvania. Make sure if you're doing mail-in voting, you have the extra envelope. So the 5 for coming. Thank you, Christina. It was amazing. Thank you, Freddie. And we hope to see you next week. And here's my daughter entering from the side of the